Hey, what's up, everybody? Back with part three again. The part three I did last night on a live is actually still linked in the description below. There are a few things that I think that I didn't expound upon a ton that I really wanted to. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna do that today. But that being said, that one is still available. It's just that the audio was really bad because I didn't enable my mic, and there's a few things I didn't want to expand on. So it's still, I guess it's valuable. I didn't want to delete it just in case somebody was like, well, what'd you say? Well, it's there. This one is to replace it. So we're going to be talking about where do we go from here with the information we have with the whole Royce report, with John MacArthur, David Gray, that whole situation. And hopefully this I do have one slide that I've added here that hopefully it'll be a little helpful to you. So let's get right into it, because there's a few things that I think what I want to do that I think was very helpful in the first video, I want to kind of repeat here, which is to go through the timeline just a little bit to get us sort of a generalized idea of what happened and when it happened. Because there's a lot of people that are saying things that I think that it's disproven by the timeline. Like you can tell by the timeline with the facts that we have that well, let's just get to it. So I'm going to put this up on the screen. This here we are not going to go through. If you want to go through this entire timeline, you're going to need to go back to video 1 of this whole part 1, part 2, part 3. You're going to need to go back to video 1. I walk through this entire timeline in video 1. Now, the one thing that's different here with this is I've highlighted red here, because something that I apparently had overlooked or I had missed at the first go around was that in the court documents that will be linked in the description as well, that I encourage everyone to read. Okay. In that court document, it states that between December 2020 and December 2021, there were this is when those events occurred that actually landed David Gray in prison, right? So during that timeline, in between that red highlight there, is when the children say that David Gray committed those heinous acts on them. And again, you can read all of that in the court report. But I think it's important to look at that because I didn't cover that the first time, for us to have a general idea of what was going on. Now, to recap, before we get on to the next thing, the letters that were sent to Eileen and the counseling that happened, the counseling ended in November 2001. And the letters were sent beginning in November 2001 to Eileen in regards to church discipline. So that being said, understand that red timeline there, that red highlight is when the offenses have said to have happened to all 3 children. And those are outlined. It happened at different times in that timeline, but it all happened within that timeline, according to the children. So according to the kids, it happened all the way up to December 2001, which is just 1 month following whenever Eileen and David's counseling ended, and when the letters were starting to get given to her as far as church discipline. Now, that being said, the next slide here is actually here. Let me put this up on the slide so you can see it. This was the slide that a few things were added to the other day because of what the Royce report had come out with her sort of follow-up article. The one thing that was added that I think is important to look at and to understand is that in November of 2003, Eileen has moved out in September 2002, right? She's moved away from Grace Community Church. She's already been excommunicated. September 2002, she moves away. In November 2003, this is when, so it's almost a year later, a little over a year later, this is when Eileen learns of those activities that we talked about in the previous slide. So that's when she learns about everything that happened in this red highlight. This is when the kids tell her about this, okay? So that happens in November of 2003, a year after she moves. Now, at around the same time, we don't have any documentation that is dated as far as I can find that either Julia Royce gives us or that I can find online of when David filed for divorce. Now, this was a big part of Julia Royce's report on the second go around, that she said that David should have been excommunicated and put under church discipline as well, because he's the one that sought out the divorce, not Eileen. Now, if we look at the timeline, though, that doesn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense for them to give David church discipline for filing divorce from Eileen when Eileen has already moved away and Eileen has already stated that she has no desire to reconcile. So the idea that Julia puts forth in the report is that David should be put under church discipline for divorcing Eileen is a little misplaced. Again, we'll talk about the other things David did, all of that other stuff we can talk about. We're going to. But her statement in the report, Julia Royce's statement in the report that David should be put under church discipline because he filed for divorce from Eileen is misguided, because by the time we get to the divorce being filed, Eileen's already moved away. It's been a year since Eileen's moved away. And she's already been excommunicated from Grace Community Church because she refuses to reconcile. And if you eliminate everything else from what's going on, there's clearly no reconciliation happening in this marriage. So I'm assuming that this is why David files for divorce. So I just want to make that clear in the Royce report. Julia makes this big thing almost that, David should be reprimanded for filing for divorce. But in the timeline, it's been a year. Eileen's moved away. It's actually very interesting to me that Eileen didn't herself file for divorce, but for whatever reason, she left it to David, or there was some other motive there that we don't know about. Now, February 20th is when David Gray gets arrested, right? So Eileen finds out about the allegations in November 2003. Then she reports it immediately to the LAPD. The LAPD take not too long to obviously start investigating it, but David Gray isn't arrested until February 20th of 2004, right? Then when he's arrested, 5 days later, Kerry Hardy writes to Grace Community Church. He writes a letter of support for David, and he begins to raise funds for David's bail and lawyer fees. Now, a couple things to note here. This letter, everybody's saying, oh, look, Grace Community Church is supporting and raising funds for somebody that is a child abuser in a number of different ways. If we look at the timeline, at this point, what they know is that David had apologized and repented for the verbal and physical abuse that had come up during counseling. This is what they know, all right? Now, again, in hindsight, we know that a lot was happening during that time because of what the kids say later. But at this time, the information that the elders of Grace Community Church have is that David has repented of and is working toward has in the past couple years worked toward reconciliation with his wife. And they see some sort of evidence that he is trying to do that. So when he gets arrested and they present this letter, they're presenting this letter. It seems to be, especially if you read it, it's linked in Royce's report. They seem to be giving him support because they say, we've seen this effort that he's putting forth. We know in counseling that he repented of this. He said he was sorry, and he sought some sort of way to reconcile with his family. So I forget the exact words that Hardy uses, but he says we have to base it on David Gray's character, on what's really true here. Now, that being said, I think it is very disingenuous for people to say that at this moment they were supporting a child abuser, because clearly at this moment, presented with the information they had on February 20th, they had allegations that had come up that David had been arrested for. As far as they knew, those were not accurate. And so they put forth this letter toward the congregation to say, we want to help our brother in Christ to raise funds for bail as well as lawyer fees. Now, on that note, again, I would encourage you a whole bunch to read Kerry's statement, Eileen's statement, the court reports, those are the three big ones. You can read a lot of the other linkable things, but those are the three big ones that I would encourage you to read, because that's going to give you a bigger picture of what's happening. That's going to give you both sides of the story from both Carrie Hardy as well as Eileen Gray. And that's also going to give you the court records of what everything that was said in court. It's like 32 pages. It's worth the read. It's hard to read at some points, but the point is that it's going to show you that. So on February 25th, when Carrie Hardy puts out this letter in support of David to raise funds for David for both bail and for lawyer fees, he is apparently operating, and I believe that at this moment he is operating under the assumption that David is being wrongly accused. That seems to be where he's coming from. Now, reading Carrie Hardy's statement, it's pretty clear that he's close to David. Like, he has a working relationship with David. He's friendly with David. He's friends with David. So I think in that moment, in those moments, even through counseling, it would have been very wise to get somebody else to counsel David and Eileen, because I think Carrie Hardy was far too biased, or it seems that he was very biased in this counseling because he knew David really well. And I think it's just not wise for a friend to counsel a friend in a professional manner like that, because you're going to have a bias probably. But so Hardy puts this letter forth in February 25th of 2004. Now, a year later, just over a year later, March 7th in 2005, David Gray is convicted. Now, we have to understand what that means. He's convicted, which means he's found guilty, okay? He's not sentenced yet, but he is found guilty of the counts that are listed in that court document. Now, again, it's important to read that court document because there were some things that they found him not guilty of, and they took those off of his sentencing because they couldn't prove that there wasn't enough proof to show that he had done those things. So there was, I think, out of the three kids, one of the charges that was brought forth, one of the kids' allegations, they couldn't find proof for it, and that was dropped. So he was charged with only two of the three, and that's important to know. Now, so then we go forth in June 6th, where David is actually sentenced, which means this is where he finds out about how much time he's going to spend in jail. Okay. Now, November 13th of 2016 is when the court document that is available for us to look at, that is linked below, is made available. Okay. Now, let's go on, because I think so. We have this timeline that's pretty clear. So let me recap really quick for you, because it's one of those things that I think we can come with different lenses on our eyeballs, depending on our bias on one way or the other. Not just bias toward John MacArthur, or not toward John MacArthur, or bias because we believe Julia Royce or we believe Eileen's statements, but just especially if we've dealt with abuse before, whether personally or with other people we know. The more pastors I talk to about cases that they've dealt with similar situations, I don't think you're going to meet a pastor that's going to tell you that it's not difficult to sit down to hear these things out and then actually try to come to a conclusion on who is telling the truth and who's not, because you are dealing solely on word of mouth. And maybe if you're lucky, somebody has witnessed some things that can substantiate a claim from a husband or a wife or a child. But most of the time, these situations are very difficult for pastors to navigate well, because you're dealing with real people, real situations that are usually have only happened between these two people, and you're trying to figure out who's telling the truth and what actually happened from two distinctively different people. Now, even though I would say from reading the reports, I think Carrie Hardy was too close to David Gray to be able to do this in an efficient way. There you can sort of see that struggle as you read Hardy's recounting of the report. But anyway, that's why I would encourage you to do that. I think there's a lot of people jumping to conclusions that have never been in a seat as many of these pastors have, and have had to do these sessions and understand the real difficulty of doing these sessions with real people in real time in a real mess. Now, that being said, that is not meant for me to say that Kerry Hardy is off the hook, because I think there's some things here that he, I think it does show that he had a bias toward David Gray. I think you can get that pretty clearly from reading his report, but you do with what you will. Now, this right here is interesting. In the Roy's report, this is where we skip from 2006, when this this court report is given, and we skip all the way to up to 2012, whenever we now have a copy, or we don't now have, the copy has been floating around, but Julia Royce uses this copy that's been floating around in this secondary report to talk about, John MacArthur supporting David Gray in prison. Now, David Johns is apparently a former member of Grace Community Church that helped David post things from prison. The Royce report reached out to David, and this is what it said. The Royce report reached out to Johns via email for comment. Johns replied, Grace Community Church did not believe some of Eileen's accusations as credible, but the justice system did. That should not have happened, but it did. Both the justice system and Grace Community Church should have come to the same conclusion. I'm very interested on two things. One, what's in between that ellipses at the end, but it did not, ... Like, I would be interested in the whole statement. Like, what was the whole thing he said? What we do have, though, is, from what we have here, is that there seems to be, at least from some of the members of Grace Community Church, this idea that David was innocent, he was falsely accused, and the justice system didn't get it right in this case. That seems to be somewhat of the conclusion of what happened. Now, I don't know if that's the case or not. In my previous video that, like, this is a redo for, I said that I think that's why we're not getting a statement from Grace Community Church or John MacArthur, because I think that that sort of statement has already been made, that they believe that David Gray was repentant, that he was not guilty of the things he was sentenced for, and that's why not only have they not made a statement, but that's why they are supporting, or have at least in the past supported, his prison ministry. I don't know if that's the case, because clearly, as I've said in the last 3 videos, Grace Community Church and John MacArthur have not put out a statement. So that is what we're sort of left to assume based on statements like these that we have. Now, that being said, here's a copy. So here's one of the copies that was on the Royce report. It's been floating around on Twitter as well. Essentially, David Gray started a ministry in prison to minister to other inmates and teach them Greek and the Bible, and apparently counseling. Now, 2 things on this, okay? One, and there's hold on, let me zoom out here. So you can't read it, but it's in the Royce report. This is in the red highlighted areas. This is an endorsement by John MacArthur, apparently, as far as we can tell. Now, this has been used to say that John MacArthur is supporting a child abuser he's supporting a child abuser's ministry in prison. 2 things with this. One, I think if we're operating out of the understanding of the timeline, like we covered at the beginning of this video, Grace Community Church seems to be operating under an understanding that the accusations brought against David are not true, as far as the sexual allegations. They also seem to be going under the assumption that the allegations that were brought up during the counseling session have been repented of, and therefore they're not holding those against him, because he admitted to those in the counseling session and repented of those in the counseling session, and therefore he's not, like, they're treating him as someone that has been redeemed, that has brought forth his sin, that has repented of it, and is working toward being sanctified in it, right? So let me say that one more time as clearly as I can. I think Grace Community Church is operating under the assumption that David Gray has repented of his sins that were brought up in counseling as physical and verbal abuse, and that the sexual abuse that he was convicted of and sentenced for didn't actually happen. That's what they're sort of operating under, that he was wrongly convicted. So when somebody says, or somebody posts that John MacArthur and Kerry Hardy are supporting or are propping up a child abuser of the sexual nature. Um, that doesn't seem to fit with the timeline in regards to how Grace Community Church sees the events occurring. Now, we all know, I mean, we have the court documentation. David Gray is clearly in prison, has been convicted and sentenced for those incredibly lewd acts that you can read about in the court document. With that being said, if you read the court document, he maintains that he did not do those things. And he also maintains that the things that are mentioned, especially if you go back to the first video, the events on like May 10th of 2001, if you go like where kind of the whole thing started, he maintains that that event was over exaggerated. Again, I don't have time to get into it. You can read that though in the court document. I would highly encourage you to do that because that gives you a really good picture. So anyway, that's what I would say. And that court document is available for everyone to look at and get to. So it's there for you. So Grace Community Church seems to be operating outside of that idea, or out of that idea, and therefore I think that's why we haven't seen a statement. That's why I don't think you're going to see a statement. That's why I don't think you're going to hear anything from Grace Community Church or John MacArthur, because they're operating under the assumption that David Gray was wrongly convicted, and the abuse that was brought up during counseling, he's already repented for and has worked toward reconciliation for, and therefore they're not going to hold past sins against him. So that's the headspace that they're operating out of. Now, you don't have to agree with them. I don't have to agree with them on that. But that seems to be sort of what I'm sorry, we'll get to that in a minute. That seems to be the sort of headspace that they're operating out of. So I think a lot of the stuff I've seen online, a lot of the videos that I've seen made are operating out of the assumption that Grace Community Church is looking at this case, or John MacArthur or Carrie Hardy or any of them are operating out of this idea in the same way that we are, that we're saying, well, he hasn't repented of the child sexual abuse, and he's in prison, and you're supporting him in prison, and he's a convicted child sex abuser. So how do those things line up? And that makes for really clickable headlines, and that makes all of us very upset. But they don't seem to see it that way. They seem to see it in a totally different light. And I think that's incredibly important to understand, because they don't think he did it. And because they don't think he did it, they don't see a need to not support him. They don't see a need to make a statement about it. They don't see a need to even address it, because 20 years ago they said we don't think he did it, and that's why we're supporting him. So I mean, that's incredibly pivotal. I mean, if we look at the timeline, when I was looking at the timeline and the paperwork and the documentation, that seems to be kind of the assumption that they're making there. And I think that's why a lot of us are really upset. And a lot of people maybe online, like a Phil Johnson, like we talked about in the last video, is like, I don't know why you're pulling people's names through the mud on a 20-year event, right? Because they've kind of already closed the books on it and they don't have anything to say about it. Now, that being said, I don't think they're going to make a statement. And a couple reasons for that. This here is one of the things that one of the reasons I think that John MacArthur especially isn't going to make a statement about it. That I don't think Grace Community Church is going to make a statement about it, is that this podcast that I've never heard of until recently, but it's called the MacArthur Center for Expository Preaching Podcast. It already has season 1 up online. They posted a season 2 trailer on March 4th, which was right before the Shepherd Conference came out, probably right along the same time as Julia Royce's, put out her first report. So it says at the very end of this trailer, it says, finally, we will have answers to the question everyone is asking: who will take over for John MacArthur when he is gone? So here's the thing. There's 2 ways we can view this. One, that John MacArthur is sort of using this to get out of these allegations, this whole controversy, and this is sort of his nice way out the door without addressing it. Church policy doesn't usually work that way. I would guess that there has been a plan in the works for a while for him to retire and for someone else to take over. And the timing of this is I think the timing is very just a coincidence. There's lots of people that don't think it's a coincidence. To be transparent and open, I think this is a coincidence. And I have a theory that maybe Julia Royce knew that he was going to retire anyway, and possibly put this out sort of to coincide with it. And I can't verify that, but she's an investigative reporter. She's dug up a lot of this very helpful documentation. And so it surmises to me that she would probably have some sort of an inside source that knows about John MacArthur's retirement. So anyway, I want to end with a couple thoughts, but before we do that, I want to go to some of the comments and see what has been said right here. So let's just pull up a couple of these because I'm not sure. It says, really have been helped by these videos, but what do you think of Hardy's writing this alleged abuse and referencing both the sexual and physical abuse in the paragraphs above happened during the time, and then it continues, when he knew about the physical abuse during counseling sessions? So the alleged I think what this means is I say simple, but let me clarify that. Whenever a pastor, and I don't know if you're a pastor or not, but whenever a pastor is counseling people in a counseling session, one of the things that you obviously have to look for is body language. This is also why, here's the thing, this is also why it would have been very helpful for Hardy to do what he should have done, which is report this to the police. Because if he would have done that, they could have done their side of the investigation and looked for bruises, looked for sort of body language as well, looked for verbal pattern changes, things like that, like investigations that police do all the time to make sure if domestic abuse is happening or isn't happening. Pastors typically are not equipped to do this. So I think that's why he puts alleged abuse, because he is trying to, I think this is Hardy's attempt to be unbiased. Now, I also think alleged abuse sort of comes from his bias as well. So I know I'm talking out both sides of my mouth here, but I think what he's doing is he's trying to say, well, I don't see any physical abuse, as far as sometimes, right, you'll see bruises on arms, bruises on legs, if bruises on faces, if it's terrible, like as far as like it's just the abuser didn't care where they hit somebody. But typically that's what you're looking for: body language, being closed in, being off to the side. He doesn't note any of that. So I think that's why he pushed alleged, he wrote down alleged abuse, because I don't think he was clear or not about when it happened. Now, after David, you may be referring to when he knew about the physical abuse. Okay, I'm sorry, I misread your question. So yeah, so when he knew about the physical abuse, I don't know why he would have put alleged. That does seem a little odd, because it doesn't make sense why he would have wrote alleged. But again, I think that goes back to a couple things, and this is just spitballing here. But he wasn't a professional counselor. I don't know how often he did this. So it could have just been a mishap there. So let's see what the other thing is. Another comment here. John MacArthur is a coward if your theory is correct. If he feels a false conviction happened, why didn't he say that? Simply so many more people would have rightfully called him out if they said that. Said that. Okay. Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where we don't have a ton of, and again, this isn't me trying to defend John MacArthur here. We don't have a lot of information that I think would have been very helpful to have. So what I mean by that is the stuff that came out during the time. The reason we have the video that was posted in the first Roy's report is because someone took a camera into the church during communion to film that. My understanding is that from people that have messaged me that go to Grace Community Church or go to churches that are like planted by Grace Community Church or share the same sort of doctrinal stance as Grace Community Church, is that this happens often. Like discipline during communion happens often. And so online, they turn the cameras off and then they deal with in-house issues in-house. So it's not broadcast to the world. And so apparently this happens a lot. So the only reason we actually have that video is because somebody took it in. So I don't know. And we wouldn't have records of, unless somebody had a great memory of him saying anything about David Gray being falsely accused or anything like that. Now, you're right. I think it would have been helpful if there would have been a document come out after the trial was finalized, after David was convicted and sentenced. But and here's the thing. Here's the thing we need to remember. There may have been a document that came out about them thinking David was wrongly convicted. Julia Royce, as much as I think she is helpful in a lot of areas, is only providing us information that I think kind of backs up her point. Now, that's everything that's come out so far, right? We don't have I haven't seen one positive piece of evidence in regards to anyone backing up David Gray, except for in the court document in which they brought evidence in from witnesses that said that the children never seemed scared around him. They babysitted the kids, and the kids never mentioned anything to him. Like, the court document is the only document that we have that ever sheds David Gray in a positive way, as far as from the church outside of Hardy's sort of counseling notes. So that, I think, is really hard to tell. This happened in 2001, 2000, 2003, or 2 rather. So not a lot of stuff was on the internet yet as far as documentation being uploaded. So who knows what we don't have, I guess, is a long answer to that. So here we go. One more comment. Hiding behind clergy exceptions is weak. I understand that was a common stance back then, but it shouldn't have been. So I think this is probably a denominational church structure difference. There's a lot of churches that do deal with things in-house, and I know a lot of people have issues with that. Now, as I said in my first video, there is a point in which the church says this is outside of anything we can help with, and that usually comes in, for example, at sexual abuse or physical abuse, and especially depending on the level of physical abuse. And then the church then obviously hands it over to the local authorities and tries to work with them. A lot of churches, though, again, denomination-wise, depending on church policy, all that, does deal with it in-house. So it's sort of a different. Same thing with the discipline, church discipline during communion. It's interesting, and I don't know Julia Royce's opinion on church discipline or how it should be done, but when the article first came out and it said that she was shamed, I think that she intentionally used that word, but I think that's a bad word to use, because in what they were doing, in what they were doing, they were doing church discipline. So it's interesting that she used that word. All right, looks like one more comment here, and then we will get back. Follow up from Dean from before. He said, I've been in pastoral ministry for a decade, and I agree with you. He should have done the common sense thing and reported the abuse to the authorities. Yeah, it's one of those things that, honestly, I don't know what training used to be, but for pastors now, I know pastoral training now says, look, you report anything. That way you can work with the authorities to get someone help if they need help, and you're still able to walk with people through the accountability process and the restoration process of going through all of it. So I want to end with this. Two things that have really been pretty apparent during this whole process. One, church discipline is clearly not practiced in a lot of churches. I don't say that just because of this case, though this case has really demonstrated people's misunderstanding of church discipline, what it's used for, what it does, just in general. Again, I think this is an odd case as far as church discipline goes, but church discipline in general is not really well understood or practiced. But in that regard, I think it's brought up a couple other things. One, that pastors clearly need to have policies in place for clear direction on what should be done during those circumstances, as far as abuse, as far as counseling, as far as, how that's all handled. And then the other thing is that I think what we need to do is make sure we have all the information that we can have before making our assumptions, right? So I say that before I get into these last points. The reason I say that is because I visually had to make a timeline to make sense of what the Royce report put forth as information, because it jumped all over the place. I think the Royce report would have done itself a great service is if it would have had that in chronological order so that it was understandable. Because in chronological order, at least we kind of get to see a bit more of the thought process of Grace Community Church and John MacArthur. Even if we disagree with them, we at least get to see their thought process in a way that's laid out in a timeline. We also would have got to see when the abuse happened in that timeline, like I presented in the first slide. So we have a clearer picture, a whole picture of what's going on at the time. We need to make sure that we're people that are diligent in making sure that we have the information we need to have. The other thing that I think has been really brought out that I didn't really mention before, but we really need to talk about redemption more. Now, of course, we have to be careful about, depending on what the severity of the sin was, how, that's dealt with and who people are around after dealing with that. But I've seen like a lot of people want to throw David Gray away right away. And again, hear me on this very clearly. What he was sentenced for and what he was convicted for are terribly horrible things that people should be locked away for, and probably worse. Okay, so hear me on that. That is terrible. On that note, though, Christians we have this gospel of grace and mercy even for the worst sins. And the interesting thing is that it seems like nobody wants to kind of even entertain the thought that David Gray could have repented of doing those things and has been and is being sanctified, and in the ministry he's doing in prison is actually a good thing and is actually helping other people through the terrible things that have happened before. Nobody seems to really want to even give him a second chance. And I think that's very telling as well. Again, terrible things. He should, if he was convicted and sentenced for those things, and that's definitely where he should be, those things being true. So he should definitely be there. But I think that we are really quick to be like, he's a child sexual abuser, and just write him off. What seems to happen, so let's go with the storyline that John MacArthur and Grace Community Church thinks that he was wrongfully sentenced, right? Again, like you said before, whether they're right or wrong on that, you can disagree. Let's go one more step and say, well, let's say, even if they think he did do it, and he should be in prison, he's not wrongfully accused, he actually did it, and he was convicted and sentenced for it. We don't know the conversations that happened after that. We don't know if he's repented after that. Again, this is why I think it would be incredibly helpful for Grace Community Church and John MacArthur to come forward and make a statement, but they don't have to. But I think it would be very helpful for them to say this, so we kind of know the thought process. But they're probably not going to do that. So let's say, we've already ran through scenario 1. Scenario 2, they believe he did do it and he is there. Then he's doing prison ministry there. And they're supporting the prison ministry there, basically saying these were horrible situations. This was terrible, but it is being redeemed in a really odd way that only God can redeem it. Now, last thing on that point. One of the things that I've got a lot of pushback for, oddly enough, but one of the things that I think John MacArthur and Grace Community Church should do, or should have done at least, is after David Gray was convicted and sentenced, if they believe that he really did it, this is why I say I don't think they believe he did it. But if they did believe he did it, they should have went to Eileen and apologized and repented and sought out for her forgiveness and some way to help her out, restore her, things of that nature. That's why I don't think they think that he actually did it, though, because none of those steps were taken. And if they do think he did it and didn't take those steps, they're disqualified. Clearly, they're disqualified if that line of thought is followed, right? So there's a lot of different roads that could be taken here. And I think a lot of us are approaching this with one singular view on how this happened and how it went down, which again is why I think it would be incredibly helpful for John MacArthur and Grace Community Church to make a statement so that we at least understood their side of it. So we understood if they think if he is wrongly convicted, if we think he is correctly convicted and they're still supporting him because of repentance and redemption, like that whole side of the story. So where we're left at a place of just saying, okay, well, we're guessing. And that's where a lot of us are going, well, are we going to still support Grace Community Church or not? Are we still going to support John MacArthur or not? Because we don't know. It's up to you, honestly, to decide which of those scenarios you think is most accurate. I've put forth what I think. I think by reading all of the things that Julie Royce has presented in the Royce Report, I honestly think that Grace Community Church and John MacArthur think that he was wrongly convicted. And therefore, that's why they haven't sought out repentance from Eileen. That's why they haven't made a statement. That's why they're probably not going to make a statement, because they are operating under the idea from all the way back in 2005 that he didn't do it. And therefore, they don't feel compelled to make a statement, and they do not feel compelled to apologize or seek repentance or anything like that. Now, again, it'd be helpful if they made a statement, but you're going to have to read the stuff. And this is what I would encourage you to do. This is the last video I'm covering on it, unless they make a statement. I don't think they're going to make a statement, so I think this will be the last video. But it's up to you to literally read through all of that stuff and come to your own conclusion. Whether Hardy and MacArthur have disqualified themselves, if Grace Community Church is worth, still supporting, all of, Master Seminary, all of that, you have to read those and decide what do you think their thinking process is here? Because we have been presented with, this is exactly how it happened. And it's just one side, it's one scenario put before us. But when you read the accounts, it's clear that it could be a couple different scenarios, and we're only seeing one of them. Is it the correct one? It could totally be the right one. It really could. But even the court documents give us about 2-3 different stories. The jury obviously decided on one of them, and that's the one that's the prevailing narrative here that I think most of us, when you put ABC 1, 2, 3 together, you come to the conclusion of. But you do have a variety of different sides of the story. Like I said in the first video, you have Carrie Hardy's side, you have Eileen Gray's side, and they're totally different perspectives. So I'd encourage you guys to read it, come to your own conclusion on it. Hopefully these videos were helpful. If they were, make sure you leave a comment, you like them, you do whatever you want with them. I don't know. This is honestly just me processing through this information, and you guys get to come along for the ride, and I hope it was helpful. So guys, thanks for subscribing, watching, doing this, communicating and having this back and forth. I really do appreciate it. It's helped me think through it. It's helped me process through it. And I won't see you again on this topic unless Grace Community Church or John MacArthur come out with a comment, which I don't think they will. So that being the case, I'll see you. We're going to be doing some more lives coming up. We're going to do a live podcast version of this with the other guys from Honest Youth Pastor. Hopefully that'll be beneficial. It'll be kind of a Q&A. So if you do want to talk about this more and force me to talk about it more, you can do that. That'll be every Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll talk to you later. Goodbye.